The suburban home in the quiet, tree-lined neighborhood of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, was supposed to be filled with laughter, joy, and the sounds of children playing. Instead, it would become the site of an unimaginable tragedy, one that would haunt the lives of Stella and Kevin forever. It was a late autumn evening when Kevin returned home from work, expecting to find his wife, Stella, and their newborn triplets. But what greeted him at the threshold was a chilling silence. The house, which had been filled with the chaotic sounds of 3 crying infants just hours before, was now unnervingly quiet. He called out for Stella, but there was no answer. Before we get deeper into the story, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Please comment below. Kevin's heart raced as he hurried to the nursery, his footsteps growing louder as dread crept into his veins. The nursery door was slightly ajar, casting a dim light into the hallway. Pushing the door open, he was greeted by a scene he would never forget. The triplets, tiny, fragile lives that had been born just a few weeks earlier, lay motionless in their cribs, still bound together by the abnormality that had defined their existence. They had been born conjoined at the chest, a rare medical phenomenon that had shocked even the most seasoned doctors. The decision to separate them had been complex and uncertain, and the surgery was still weeks away. In the corner of the room, sitting on the rocking chair with a vacant, almost serene expression, was Stella. Her hands were clasped in her lap, and her eyes were distant, as though she were lost in another world. Kevin rushed to the cribs, his breath catching in his throat as he touched their cold, lifeless bodies. "No, no," he whispered, shaking as reality crashed over him like a wave. His heart pounded in his chest, and tears welled up in his eyes. He turned to his wife, disbelief and horror mixing with a rising fury. "Stella, what did you do?" She didn't respond. Her eyes, dull and vacant, never left the floor. Kevin fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed 911. The call went through and he tried to find his voice, but the words caught in his throat. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice answered. My wife, our babies. Kevin could barely form a sentence, his voice breaking. They're dead. My wife, she killed them. The dispatcher's voice remained professional, though there was a clear shift in tone as Kevin's words registered. Sir, stay calm. Help is on the way. Kevin dropped to his knees, cradling his face in his hands as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had to stay strong. He had to hold it together for the sake of understanding what had just happened. But how could he? When the police arrived, the scene was nothing short of haunting. Stella sat silently, unmoving, as officers and paramedics rushed into the nursery. She didn't resist when they gently took her hands and led her away. She barely seemed to notice them at all. Kevin, on the other hand, was inconsolable. His mind raced as he struggled to comprehend how everything had fallen apart. Just days ago, they had been talking about the future, about the surgery that could give their children a chance at a normal life. He couldn't understand how Stella could have done something so monstrous. But as the investigation unfolded, the dark truth began to surface. Stella had struggled silently for months, ever since the moment she had discovered she was pregnant with triplets. The news had initially been a shock, but when the doctors revealed that the babies were conjoined, something inside her shifted. She had become withdrawn, her anxiety spiraling into a deep, consuming depression. The pressure of being a mother to not one, but 3 medically fragile children had weighed on her in ways Kevin hadn't fully understood. Doctors had tried to prepare her for the challenges ahead, hospital visits, surgeries, and the constant care the triplets would require. But Stella had seen only one thing: a mistake. An unbearable, irreversible mistake that she couldn't live with. The love she had once felt for her unborn children had turned into resentment, a poisonous emotion that festered in her mind until it drove her to the unthinkable. In her fragile mental state, Stella began to see the triplets as a manifestation of her deepest fears and failures. She had told no one, not even Kevin, about the dark thoughts swirling in her mind. She had become adept at hiding her emotional turmoil, putting on a brave face whenever he was around. But behind closed doors, she had begun to unravel. During her initial interrogation, Stella remained unresponsive, her eyes distant and her words incoherent. Psychiatrists were called in to evaluate her, and it became clear that she was in a state of severe psychosis. Her mind had fractured under the weight of her untreated postpartum depression, compounded by the overwhelming fear and despair she felt over raising conjoined triplets. Through the haze of her mental breakdown, Stella had come to believe that the only way to correct the mistake was to end it. She saw her children not as innocent lives, but as a burden she could no longer bear, a mistake that needed to be erased. Kevin, meanwhile, was left grappling with the horrific reality that his wife, the woman he loved, the mother of his children, had taken their lives in a moment of delusional despair. The guilt and anger threatened to consume him as he replayed every conversation, every moment, trying to figure out how he had missed the signs. How had he not seen the depth of her suffering? The media descended on the tragedy, turning it into a national story. Headlines screamed about the mother who had taken the lives of her conjoined triplets, painting Stella as a monster. But for Kevin, the narrative was far more complicated. He knew she wasn't a cold-blooded killer. She was sick, terribly, tragically sick. The legal proceedings that followed were a blur. Stella was charged with 3 counts of murder, but her defense team quickly shifted the focus to her mental state, arguing that she was not responsible for her actions due to her psychosis. The court-ordered psychiatric evaluations confirmed that Stella had been suffering from severe postpartum psychosis at the time of the killings, and the trial soon turned into a discussion about mental health, maternal stress, and the failures of the system to provide adequate support for mothers in crisis. Kevin sat in the courtroom every day, watching as experts testified about Stella's mental illness. He listened to the doctors describe how her mind had become unmoored from reality, and how her untreated depression had spiraled into something far more dangerous. He wanted to hate her for what she had done, but all he could feel was sadness. An all-consuming sadness for the family they had lost, and the wife who had slipped through his fingers. In the end, Stella was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and was committed to a psychiatric facility for long-term treatment. The ruling brought little comfort to Kevin. His children were gone, and the woman he had once shared his life with was a shell of her former self. Months passed, and Kevin found himself alone in the house that had once been filled with the promise of a future. The nursery remained untouched, a ghostly reminder of the lives that had been taken too soon. He visited Stella occasionally, though their conversations were stilted and filled with long silences. She was improving, the doctor said, but it was a slow and painful process. There were days when she didn't even remember what she had done. As Kevin stood in the empty nursery one evening, staring at the cribs that had never truly been used, he felt the weight of his grief press down on him. The silence in the house was deafening, but it was a silence he would have to live with. He had lost his children, his wife, and the life he had once imagined. All that was left were memories of what could have been, and the unshakable, haunting question, could he have saved them all, if only he had seen the signs? In that silence, Kevin knew there would never be an answer. Only the cold, unchangeable reality of a tragedy born from despair. Forgiveness is a complex and deeply personal journey, especially in the wake of a tragedy as profound as Kevin's. The weight of Stella's actions loomed over him like a dark cloud, making the question of forgiveness almost unbearable to consider. Every day, Kevin found himself caught between 2 warring emotions: love for the woman he had once known, and overwhelming grief for the loss of his children. For months after the court's verdict, Kevin avoided thinking about forgiveness. He drowned himself in routine, trying to rebuild some semblance of normalcy in a life that felt anything but. His visits to Stella were infrequent and painful, marked by long silences or brief exchanges about her treatment. The woman sitting across from him in the sterile psychiatric facility barely resembled the vibrant person he had married. She was lost in the fog of her illness, still grappling with the enormity of what she had done. We hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and we will see you in the next one.